Okay, there we go. All right, so welcome to our continuation of the art lecture series about the Grand Beginnings, which is an exhibition we have on at Sama Altoona. It is looking at art history through Sama's permanent collection. And Sama is the Southern Alleghenies Museum of Art. We just kind of shorten it into that little phrase. So yeah, so today we are looking at the dawn of American art, really looking at portraiture and power, how they defined the American style. And we're going to do that through kind of four artists or a family of artists. So Gilbert Stewart, a painting you see behind me, Thomas Sully, the Peel family, and Joshua Johnson. So we have Gilbert Stewart in the exhibition. We have Sully and Peel in our permanent collection. So if you come to the museum, you'll be able to see the Gilbert Stewart piece behind me on display. So to understand our history, we really have to consider the who, what, where, why, how, the influences and impacts of the artists and the time, and that includes the social, political, and environmental. So part of this is to kind of consider where the world was in the 1700s, especially the later 1700s and the start of the 1800s, which is where most of the pieces that we're going to look at today are from. So that, we're looking at kind of the birth of the United States, going from a British colony into its own nation, and the revolution, the tumultuous time between those periods, and really kind of the confusion, if you think about it, of what does government look like without a monarch. And so all of this starts to play into factors of how the colonialists, or then the new Americans, are going to consider how they paint themselves, how they portray themselves, and in what manners and styles that they fashion their lives. So we'll continue to look at this as we go through it. So starting at kind of the basics of what is a portrait, which is something that would be really fun for all of us to share what we think is a portrait. But I think most of us can agree in some way it's a representation of a person. Now, in more recent studies, more recent artworks, that doesn't always mean like the face of a person. It could mean anything from a still life of their items and what you could gather from that, or it could be colors, and it could be quite abstract. In this situation, we're looking at kind of a historic painting. Sorry, we'll just mute that. We're looking at historic paintings. I thought I muted it. And so those are going to be more traditional, like the portrait behind me. Okay. Question? Okay. So what truths and questions does a portrait communicate? And I want you to think a little bit about how you use portraiture in your life. If you have a Facebook or a LinkedIn, you can use different kinds of portraits in those settings to present a certain version of yourself. And you can, present a different version based on how you photograph yourself or how you choose which images to use. So when thinking of these portraits, the sitters were often involved in that process. So we've gotten 3 calls. I'm so sorry. So when we have all of these things together, we're really looking at how people construct their identity through portraiture. What might a portrait express about a person? How does it reflect the sitter's community, settings, family, or friends? And what does the portrait reveal about the artist? So this could be anything that if you're, say, a photographer and you get a picture taken of you with a camera, that is going to be pretty clear that you use a camera. If you're a writer, an author, and you have a picture of you with your book. And so those kind of objects can be a way to describe how the person is. But like the portrait behind me that we'll look at a little bit more, there's not much in there, but there's still a lot in there. So each of these questions are something to think about as we look through these portraits. How is legacy preserved, manipulated, and constructed through portraiture? So we are going to look at a lot of portraits of George Washington today, because Gilbert Stewart, who's behind me here, he painted a lot of the portraits of George Washington that you've seen. And, we don't have photographs, we have these portraits, and how does that create a legacy of that man? If we had only pictures of him with this big grin,
Why make this larger?
that would be a very different experience. And who has access to portraiture then? Who has access to portraiture now? So as we look at the 1700s, we can kind of agree, we can look at how portraiture is very different now. You can pull out your camera, you can pull out your phone, your iPad, your computer, and create a portrait, create a representation of yourself. That in the 1700s was an hours, weeks, months-long process that often would include the sitter either sitting there for a long time, sketches were being done. It was much more intensive and therefore much more expensive. There were very few people that could do it to a realistic level. So this was a kind of a costly luxury that really only the elite at the time could afford. And now it's a much more democratic experience where people from all different age ranges, all different classes of society can create a portrait. Now, not all portraits are created equal still, but there is something kind of satisfying that, that has changed quite a bit, but is still different. So these are things to consider. We're looking at equity within the arts, and that's an important conversation to have. So we're going to start with Gilbert Stewart. Gilbert Stewart, he was one of the foremost painters in the early United States. His portraits included figures like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and his most iconic portrait you'll probably recognize when we get to the end is actually also on the $1 bill. So Stewart was born in 1755 in Kingston, Rhode Island. There's like some confusion on how he first learned to sketch, how he got into the arts, but he may have learned how to sketch faces from an enslaved man named Neptune Thurston in Newport, Rhode Island. But he was also an organ player. And so he often supplemented his income at local churches to play at the organ for their church service when his portrait experience wasn't enough, when his commissions were insufficient. So he began to study under Cosmo Alexander, who was a painter in Newport. He ended up stranded in Scotland at one point. He had a really kind of tumultuous experience. And that was everything from, he ended up taking a lot of commissions and a lot of jobs, and he would get that money and wouldn't end up completing the portrait or delivering any sort of product in the end. And I guess contract law maybe wasn't as strong then, so he ended up just being able to kind of grift through that, finishing portraits kind of as he wanted to. So we're going to go through some of his portraits here. So this is a self-portrait, and this was done in 1778, and it's at the Redwood Library in Rhode Island. This was Horatio Gates. Stewart began to paint very well-to-do people after he became much better at it. And as he was painting these individuals, he would get them connected to more and more of their friends. So some of it was he painted John Jay, who then connected him with George Washington. And Stewart saw this as a great opportunity to create substantial income. George Washington was very popular, not only in the United States, but also abroad. And he thought that if he could make good portraits of George Washington, he could then make copies of those and sell them and do that. So that was his financial plan. It was a business plan as much as anything else. So he said, "I expect to make a fortune by Washington alone. I calculate upon making a plurality of his portraits, full length, will enable me to realize, and if I should be fortunate, I'll repay my English and Irish creditors." And he had more creditors than just in England and Ireland. So he continued to do these kind of half-complete commissions throughout throughout America, and then was now making these portraits of George Washington as a way to supplement his income and to really kind of dive into this business plan. This is a portrait of Captain Joseph Anthony, and Joseph Anthony was a merchant in Philadelphia and actually the first cousin of Gilbert Stewart. And so he did several portraits of Captain Joseph Anthony, not quite like a muse, but more as a kind of respected peer. And so this portrait is similar to the portrait behind me, who's also Captain Joseph Anthony. They're probably about a year apart. And Stewart wrote to his cousin Joseph Anthony saying that he was going to Philadelphia not only to complete this portrait, but to also work on the president's portrait at the time. So Stewart painted Washington. This is another Joseph Anthony. So you can see how it kind of changes. This medium is fascinating here. It's watercolor on ivory, which was used quite often at the time for these much smaller miniature portraits. So this is a very iconic Gilbert Stewart painting, and then has been replicated since by other painters. But this is his George Washington. This painting became the iconic symbol of, you have the kind of tie-in to democratic societies before ours. You have Washington and this oratorial pose. This image becomes really iconic, and Stewart is able to finance his life for a little bit longer, even though he's not always the best businessman. And then he has these ones. So he has dozens of portraits of Washington, anywhere from the full length to this waist up style. And the one that he's most famous for is this unfinished George Washington piece that Martha Washington commissioned after George Washington died. And he never finished it, and she was a little frustrated with him, to say the least. And what you might notice, George Washington's face actually has changed through the years. So this was painted later in life when he didn't have teeth, which adjusts the way your jaw sits on your face because you have missing that part there. So they have different life casts and forensic renderings of Washington's face that they have at Mount Vernon. And if you come into the exhibition, you'll be able to see a young George Washington when he still had teeth, as a painting that was done by two artists, Pamela Patrick White and Bryant White, who live in Everett, Pennsylvania, which I encourage you to come in and see, which is really fun. So this is Gilbert Stewart's legacy, is really in these giants of early American political life and of the success and wealth of these individuals. And keeping in mind that at this time, they were still trying to figure out, should Washington be painted like a king? You think of the royal paintings of, say, King George. It's a much more extravagant experience than this is. This is much more, muted, and it's dignified and refined and honored, but it's not about decadence. And so I think that you can start to see how early American life gets played into these paintings, and not just looking at their English backgrounds or their Irish backgrounds, but more into their future and their present state and how they want to move forward with how they portray themselves. So if you want to see this portrait, you can either go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, or you can look at your $1 bill. All right, so Thomas Sully, we'll start with him next. So Sully, we'll get there we go. This is also a Thomas Sully piece, which you just saw a couple slides ago. Thomas Sully actually studied under Gilbert Stewart, and he made some of his money on recreating paintings by Gilbert Stewart. So this was the North Carolina State Assembly said, we want a painting of George Washington, and they asked for a couple quotes from a couple painters. And Rembrandt Peale said it'd be $1,500 for a full-length portrait of George Washington, and an additional $1,000 for a copy of the work. And Sully said that he would just copy Gilbert Stewart's rendition, which is this portrait, for $400. So they chose Sully and got this painting. So it's fascinating to see this almost exact recreation that then continues that original legacy. So it's really easy now to have an image kind of go viral. That took a lot more in the 1700s and 1800s. Sully's work is a lot more free to me. It has a lot more of those hints of impressionism, and it's coming along later. This is 1821. This is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was 78 when this portrait was taken. And Sully ended up doing 2,631 paintings. And so he was very prolific for that time. And there's some discussion about how early American painters, the process became a lot more people in the upper middle class, in the middle class, and in the elite society wanted portraits, but there weren't as many classically trained portrait artists in this new nation. So a lot of the portrait artists that began ended up leaving out some of the detail that was really common in earlier works, in English works, and in the work that you're seeing in the mid 1700s. So you see this kind of shift into a less detailed, quicker, almost more impressionist style artwork. So, this piece is still very detailed, but it's not as rigid as you might see in some of those gigantic portraits of years past. They were trying to make a different product that was quicker, smaller, and could get out more easily. So you also have this portrait that he did of Andrew Jackson. And you can see a lot of the influence of Gilbert Stewart. You see that there's a muted background, there's a real focus on the individual, not on their clothes, not on their place. It's focused on who they are in the portrait, on their face. And it's not like each individual hair is defined. It's more of that impressionist feeling that we'll start to see here in at this time that's starting to be popular in Europe. So Sully was born in 1783, and he did spend most of his life in Philadelphia, and he painted Thomas Jefferson, John Quincy Adams, the Marquis de Lafayette, and he also was very interested in music. So he painted a lot of musicians and composers, and he also painted the Passage of the Delaware. He really loved historic painting. This is the piece that Sama has within our permanent collection. So this is Lord David Montague Erskine. And he loved history and portraits, and he loved this kind of softer style of portraiture. So we're going to talk about the Peel family as we move away from Thomas Sully. And the Peel family is a really fascinating dive into this family of American artists. So this is a complex illustration, but it was a family, and it started off as Charles Willson Peel, who was this amazing painter, the patriarch of the family, and they had a ton of kids, as you do in the 1700s, and they encouraged each of the children, including their daughter, to become painters. And in that process, this is a sketch from Rembrandt Peale of a sample paint palette. And he's sending this to Mary Jane Peale to say, you can put your burnt sienna here, this is white and a little bit of sienna. This is raw umber, and this is how you construct your palette. And which, encouraging female artists to become artists through education is very exciting to see. And there's some different things about it that's really fun with the Peel family. So they had 10 children, and we're going to be focusing mostly on Mary Jane Peale, who was a descendant of this family. She was born in this painting is done in 1843, and it's by her uncle, Rembrandt Peale. So the Peel family is considered the first American family of artists. Again, the patriarch, Charles Willson Peel, and they did encourage educating women in the arts. They had no issue with Mary Jane Peale going and painting, and thought that it was a noble pursuit. So this is one of the portraits that we have from Mary Jane Peale within the exhibition, within the Sama permanent collection. So Mary Jane Peale also did still lives, but her family was really well known for portraiture. And they all really like this kind of luscious style, this rich colors and bright scenes. This is a kind of very different thing because it wasn't a portraiture, which is what she was really well known for. And Mary Jane was the daughter of Rubens Peale, and they lived in New York City until they moved to Pennsylvania. They lived in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. So she has some like interesting, she studied at a few different places, studied with mostly personal instructors. And she has this funny little story of on her 25th birthday, she wrote in her diary, "Today is my 25th birthday. This is the day I have made up my mind to furnish a room and commence painting professionally, to begin a life for myself." And she really did. She did that. And she, despite proposals of marriage, Mary Jane remained single and led a rich life as an unmarried artist. In the 1860s, she traveled to Europe, to Paris, Geneva, Luxembourg, and many other places to see the museums and painting collections. In the 1870s, she mingled with the nation's intellectual elite in Washington. So with the Smithsonian's group and all of the artists that were there doing a lot of political portraiture. And when she died at the age of 72, her obituary said that she was this well-known portrait painter and was the last of the family of famous portrait painters. So it's really fascinating to see, you know, especially female artists at this time working in a way that really captures and begins to continue the tradition of American art. So we're going to go into here Joshua Johnson, and the actual spelling of the last name could be Johnston or Johnson. So historians have they don't have that much information about this gentleman. So Joshua Johnson was a self-taught painter, and he was a man of mixed descendancy. He started off as a slave, and he's the earliest documented professional African-American painter in the United States. He was active in Baltimore primarily, but he did do work in different states. So he was, his reputation went across state lines. And he has this interesting thing because he really goes out and promotes himself, and we still have records of that. And one of them that was really, really fantastic was he talked about himself as a self-made genius, willing and ready to do anything you ask of him as he goes to paint. And he actually had what is kind of referred to as like a French provincial style of that stiff, rigid bodies, rigid faces. And he also did, it's not going back. He also did portraits of families together, which was very odd at the time. Families would be individual portraits of each person, but he would do like 5 members of a family sitting on a couch, and they'd all sit like this and have these oval faces. And it might have been a little bit more rudimentary considering education here at this time, but he was very, very prolific and doing these kinds of paintings and capturing this kind of upper middle class of especially Baltimore. So this is what he wrote in his advertisement: "A self-taught genius deriving from nature and industry his knowledge of the art, and having experienced many insuperable art obstacles in pursuit of his studies, it is highly gratifying to him to make assurances of his ability to execute all commands." So this is his quote in an advertisement called Portrait Painting, I guess, at the Baltimore Intelligencer in 1789. So it's also pretty fascinating to think of advertising, language from advertising being used kind of as a biography of this person hundreds of years later, which is just fascinating to me of how you might self-promote on Instagram, and maybe they'll pull that in 200 years to talk about your life. So one thing I want to ask you as like a self-reflection moment is, how do you choose to present yourself through portraiture? That could be, again, we talked about LinkedIn, Facebook, different ways that you have your portrait presented, but also thinking of obituaries, for example. What would your image be that would be like, this is who I am? And what does that reveal about you? And this is something that I think is really exciting about portraiture as we kind of really explore art history. Is a lot of times it was the artist making the decision of how the person was presented. And if, that is really fascinating then to see the artist's influence, but also then knowing that they're getting paid and expected to deliver a certain type of product. So as you are in charge of your visual expression, this is something that's really fun to think about in the context of today. So I want to talk a little bit upcoming at Sama Altoona. I know we are keeping this to a tight 30 minutes. February 8th, we're going to be looking at expansionism and naturalism, looking at the 1800s. We're going to touch a little bit upon Impressionism and the French influence that began to happen at the later 1800s. February 22nd, we're going to be looking at modern art, really the turn of the century, 1900s, what we're seeing coming out, all these new mediums. And then March 8th, we're going to be looking and discussing contemporary art. And this one's going to be a little bit more of a discussion because it's not as historic as it is asking you to join in about what you might think is coming with contemporary art and sharing some exciting things that have happened lately. And just as another note, February 11th, Sama is hosting a fundraising event called From Italy with Love at the Lakemont Casino here in Altoona. And if you go to that, you get, I think it's like 12 to 14 different samplings of wine. There's dinner, there's all sorts of things like that. They do a little like comedy show to teach you how to like hold your wine glass. So if you're interested in that, all of the information's on our website, which you can see there. And we are open here at the museum Wednesday through Sunday, 12 to 4:30. And the Grand Beginnings exhibition that we're talking about here closes March 13th, 2022. And just also in case you are interested, we do have this book. It's called the Selections from the Permanent Collection. And so it can tell you a little bit about what we have in our permanent collection. And you can see, there he is, our Captain Joseph Anthony here. So if you are interested in that, we do have copies here. But we will be going through some of the things in that book anyway. So I want to thank you all so much for attending. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I will respond, but I also want to respect that it's been 30 minutes and we are trying to make sure that you have the amount of time you need to do everything you need to do on this Tuesday. So thank you all so much. If you have any questions, please feel free to call or email and we look forward to seeing you on February 8th.